We'll now hear from Andy Atkins, who is the CEO of Rocha UK. Andy will link the global climate emergency to the local level and talk about how churches can take local action through the eco-church framework.
Well, good morning, first of all. It's a pleasure to be with you, albeit from a distance. I know the original intention was all to be together, but we've all long abandoned those dreams at the moment, but it's great that we can be together this way. In all my 35 years of campaigning on social justice and the environment, I actually can't remember a time so fraught with both risk and threat, and also with opportunity. It's scary, it's also exciting. And which triumphs, the threats or the opportunities, will make the world of difference to our children and our grandchildren. I have just had my first, or rather my daughter-in-law has just had my first. Indeed, which way this paradox plays out will determine whether we leave them an inhabitable earth at all. So I believe that as Christians and as churches, we can have a critical influence on this outcome. And we would be doing a service not just to the world and being a powerful witness to the loving God we serve, but actually it would really help the church itself, which is not the reason to do it. But I don't think that's an accident if the church was seen to be so much more relevant to what a younger generation in particular is concerned about. So in the next 20 minutes, I just want to look and canter through a number of things which we can unpack more in questions. I want to look at where the world is at on climate change very briefly and why we need to get to net zero fast. I want to look at the ways in which the church could make a difference. And I'll touch on how eco-church can help your church do precisely that. And the workshops later will go into much more detail on that. So first of all, where is the world on climate change? And I'm sure you wouldn't be on this call if you didn't already know that the world is not in a good place. So let me just summarize the big picture. The international climate negotiations in Paris in 2015 agreed a global goal of keeping average global temperature rise, it's a bit techie, beneath 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels before human-induced climate change really took off, and to try to keep it as close to 1.5 degree rise as possible. We need to do this to avoid catastrophic climate change, and by this we mean parts of the world becoming uninhabitable in this century. Too hot for humans to live, too hot for crops to grow, too short of fresh water because of droughts and the disappearance of mountain glaciers, drowned by sea level rise. Indeed, like the islands I grew up on in the Pacific already are being drowned. I visited them 18 months ago, was shocked to see what's happening to the place I first remember in life. Too many places scorched by wildfires. That's what we're talking about. Now, this is really, really scary, but we absolutely have to face the truth of the scale, the severity, and the urgency of action on this. Otherwise, we're not dealing with the real issues. But there is good news, having put the fear of God into us, perhaps. And the good news is that the solutions are absolutely out there in renewable energy, in energy efficiency, in electric transport, in restoration of land, in changes in farming practices, in changes in diet. And moreover, every single one of these things has co-benefits. It's not just good for the climate, it's really good for human health. It's really good for nature. It's really good for communities. To give you one example, recent statistics show that they are now thought to be 40 to 50,000 people a year dying in the UK of air pollution. Just compare that with what we've just been through on COVID. COVID is terrible, but actually we've got about a third of that number dying every year because of air pollution in this country. That air pollution is caused by the burning of fossil fuel, largely. Some agricultural chemicals in there as well, incidentally, derived from fossil fuel. Wouldn't it be great if we just got rid of fossil fuels so that people didn't have to die of air pollution, never mind climate change? So that's just one example of these so-called co-benefits of action on climate change. In short, then, addressing climate change would not just avoid future catastrophe for today's young, it would make it better for everybody right now. So the sooner we move on this, the more we reap those benefits, as well as avoiding catastrophe. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited actually about responding to climate change, why I'm so excited about the opportunities and want us to be aware of those, as well as the very definite threat. However, that's the good news. I need to go back to some less good news. It's now 6 years since the Paris Accord, and countries have done nothing like enough to avoid catastrophe. Indeed, the world is currently on course for a 3 to 4 degree rise in global average temperatures, okay, within the next decades, by the end of this century, almost certainly, if we don't change. We can see the evidence almost every day. Just think of some of the news headlines you will have recalled since the Paris conference in 2015. Killer heat waves across Northern Europe in 2018 that killed thousands of people, particularly the old and vulnerable, those with respiratory diseases and so on. Mega wildfires in Australia in 2019. Record summer temperatures in the Arctic last year, so that the icy tundra was actually on fire. That's what's going on. The evidence is there. And this week, the World Meteorological Office confirmed that 2020 was the joint hottest year ever recorded. It would have been the hottest ever recorded had it not been for the natural La Nina cycle, which actually tends to cool things down. So without that, last year, without doubt, would have been the hottest ever recorded. And global average temperatures reached 1.2 degrees above the historical average. So this week, the International Energy Agency, the most trusted international body on energy use and sources, said that we need to cut greenhouse gas emissions 45% this decade, not by 2050, this decade, if we are to have a reasonable chance of limiting climate change, global warming, to 1.5 degrees. So that, in a nutshell, is why in the last few years there's been a gathering movement to aim for net zero greenhouse gas emissions as soon as we can possibly get there. You can understand why it's necessary now if you didn't before. Let's just be a little bit techie here. I want to give you a definition of what net zero actually means. It doesn't mean emitting no greenhouse gas emissions at all. Rather, it means balancing the amount of greenhouse gases we emit into the atmosphere with an equivalent amount taken out by, for example, planting trees, restoring wetland and forest, which naturally absorb greenhouse gases. And also a degree of mechanical carbon capture and storage, they call it, which is basically siphoning off the greenhouse gas emissions from energy plants, from big industries, steel, coal, cement, and so on, and burying it in the ground. Now, incidentally, that is technology which is being rolled out at small scale, but has not yet been done at big scale. The key point here is that to have any chance of balancing those two things at a level that we can survive at, we actually have to cut our overall emissions very steeply, very fast. It's no point balancing them at a catastrophic level, obviously. We need to balance them at a safe level, and that means we have to cut very, very fast. Now, countries have started to pledge to get to net zero. As you know, the UK was among the first of the rich countries to do so. And in just this week, Thursday, the US has followed suit. And at least a dozen countries have now pledged to get to net zero by a certain date. And the dates differ, but 2050 is a common denominator. So that's great. But, and it's a very, very big but, statements of intent, while vital, I believe, to set direction, I'm always doing them within a Rocha, saying this is where we need to get to in the next 5 years. That's lovely, but they don't in themselves make any impact on climate change at all. In the end, they're only as good as the policies and the actions that we take to achieve them. And that has been the big problem. I've been going to international climate negotiations since the 1990s. Year after year, the international community has made pledges to act, but has not delivered. 2 decades have gone by, and time is absolutely running out now. To give a very live example, Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced this week that the UK would accelerate its journey to net zero. Hurrah! I agree, that's fantastic. However, as has been widely commented by the energy and environmental community, recent government decisions, as recent as only the week before, will in fact make matters worse. We're currently due to invest 27 billion of COVID recovery funds in a road building program. We're opening the door to the expansion of airports. The government has just abolished the home greening program they only brought in a year ago. They've slashed incentives to buy electric vehicles, and they're giving the green light to a new coal mine, although that is now on hold because of protest. So I need to be absolutely clear here on behalf of Rocha. Bold statements of intent, if not followed swiftly by the right policies, actions, and expenditure, will be much worse than empty rhetoric. They will be lethally deceptive rhetoric. We have no time anymore to be saying things and doing the opposite. So what are the implications for the church now? What does the science and the history of government foot dragging suggest the church needs to do? Well, first, there are whole sections of civil society now need to take action in whatever way they can to cut their own emissions. And the church is one of those sectors, but it's a very important one. And it's inspiring, absolutely right, that in the last year, each of the Church of England, the Church in Wales, the Church of Scotland have set a net zero target for 2030 for their own operations. And that's much more aligned with what the science is telling us is necessary than government 2050 targets. Frankly, 2050 is, in my view, too late. So well done the churches for setting that ambition to go sooner. But secondly, it's absolutely critical that society not just organizes itself to cut its own emissions, but actually it organizes itself to hold governments to account now to deliver their promises. There simply is no more time for broken promises. So let me now look at the potential contribution of the church to addressing this. And this is where I get really excited again, even on a Saturday morning. I think the church has huge assets and resources to bring to bear on this issue. I can't actually think of another section of civil society that has such assets. Now, I may be biased. I've come from a long line of vicars and nuns, in fact, just to complicate the matter. But you know, I have grown up in the church. I love the church. I want to see the church thrive. So I may be biased, but I honestly can't think of a sector of civil society that can contribute more in such a variety of ways. So consider these things. First of all, the geographical presence of the church. There are over 50,000 communities, worshiping communities in the UK, Christian church alone. I'm not even talking about the faith groups at this point, with a presence in every village, town, city, neighborhood. Most have buildings, which of course require heating and lighting and therefore use energy and add to the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. So if this energy is coming from fossil fuel sources and the church cuts it, it's making a contribution. Secondly, there's land. Churches have land. Not all churches have a churchyard, but most do. And the denominations as a whole have huge land holdings. The Church of England, Church Commissioners, is thought to own upwards of 100,000 acres. So the way that land is managed, whether for nature or against nature, for storing carbon or actually making carbon emissions worse, can make a critical difference to not just the church's cut of its carbon, but actually to the national situation as well. And then churches have financial clout, don't we? We've heard a lot recently, and many of you here have been deeply involved, I'm sure, in moves to have the churches, different denominations, particularly the Church of England, use their investments to not promote fossil fuel, but to promote green energy and so on. We all have, all denominations have investment funds, pension funds, and so on. Those can be invested in the right things, in restoring land, in green energy, and so on. And local churches all spend money, whether it's on tea and coffee and biscuits for after church, replacement of an old boiler, or £1 million church refit, as my church has just done. Whether it buys fair trade drinks or not, whether it buys another gas boiler or switches to a ground source heat pump, all make a difference to church and UK greenhouse gas emissions. So that's financial clout we've got. And even where we feel skint as a church, and I know many churches are really suffering at the moment, when you combine the financial resources of the church and the fact that we do spend money, even if sometimes we can't afford it, What we spend it on can make the world of difference. Let me take another thing, another resource the church has, the sheer number of people. And again, I think figures are all over the place at the moment because people have noted more people going back to church online than previously. But before the pandemic, although regular church going was declining to some degree, there was still, depending on how you define it, 2 to 3 million people regularly worshipping church in this country. That is a huge number when you compare it with other sectors of society, whether it's several trade unions do not have that kind of membership. No other religious body has that kind of membership as the Christian church in this country. Huge numbers of people. Now, if those people are also influenced by what they hear in church, what is and is not talked about, and how it's talked about, then churches can have a massive influence on how a big section of the public is actually responding to this generational crisis. Now, if we all, or even a quarter of churches, talked about caring for God's creation as a normal part of our personal discipleship and a key part of overall church mission, it could make a huge difference actually to what the public think. Imagine that then, what a game-changing influence it could have, not just on the church's impact on climate, but actually on the UK's own impact, if the churches use these resources that it's got to make a difference. So those are other reasons why I see churches responding to the climate crisis is that, in fact, such an exciting opportunity, not just a response to a threat that we must make. It's a really good thing in its own right. And I genuinely believe it will strengthen the church itself if it is seen to be responding to society's needs now, serving the poor and the vulnerable in our midst, looking after the needs and the interests of the future generation, intergenerational justice. That cannot be bad for the church. It's a good thing to do in its own right, never mind climate change, which is why we need to react. So let me turn then to how eco-church can help your local church and your denomination and your network contribute to reaching.
Just lost Andy there for a second. He warned this might happen. Hopefully Andy will come back to us.
Encourage churches to go green. But as we've gone on, Rocha and indeed many of you, the users of eco-church, have developed it to be something much, much more than an online award scheme. It's now becoming, you could describe it as a national community of churches addressing the environmental crisis together, using a common framework and a growing toolkit and learning and speaking up together. It's a community with a whole load of assets of its own that we are using together to make a difference on this issue. Incidentally, not just climate, but on nature and resource use too. But of course, they all link together. As I've said, land, nature can be used to absorb carbon emissions. We can't disconnect nature from climate change. So let me start and just unpack that a bit for you. And I hope this is helpful. And I'm sure Catherine and others in the subsequent workshops can develop much more detail on this if you're not familiar with the program. So I won't go into too much of the technical detail now. I'll talk about the philosophy, and I hope that's helpful. So let me start with the framework. Basically, if the church registers for eco-church online, which is free and only takes a few seconds, it will get access to a sophisticated survey, which it can then apply to its own church life and practice. And this covers 5 categories, which the workshops are on. You know about this: teaching and worship, what the church is saying about these issues, buildings and energy use, land, which hits on nature and carbon, community and global engagement, which includes speaking up, campaign, and lifestyle and money. So those 5 categories cover many of the assets, the resources that the church itself has got to bring to this challenge. Now, the survey, however, doubles not just as an initial assessment of where your church is at now, but as a guide to where your church can go next. And that's the beauty of it. So as a church reaches a certain level, we recognize its achievement with a bronze, silver, and gold award. But it's a menu of options for churches to pick the next action they're going to take. So that's the framework part of it. So how's it a toolbox? Well, we don't just provide a survey. Behind most of the questions in the survey, there are online resources that support the church in taking relevant action, whether it's strengthening its teaching in worship or looking at how to get your church building off fossil fuel energy. We're in the process of doing a thorough update of these online resources, in fact, and we're adding new tools to them as we develop. So, for example, we've recently added a sophisticated church's carbon calculator, which we developed with our sister organization, Climate Stewards, and actually in close coordination with the Church of England. But it's free and it's available to all denominations. Let me now address the community aspect that I spoke about. And this, for me, again, is one of the most exciting because of the possibilities it gives. It's also the most realistic. Let me say that my Rocha Eco Church team is at the moment 2.5 people. Okay, there's now more than 3,500 churches registered for Eco Church. There's no way in the world a small charity can keep something this size going on its own. It has to become a joint operation. I hope you can hear me. It's saying my internet is unstable. I'm getting some nods. Okay, that's good. So as I said, community. There are already more than 3,500 registered Eco Church in England and Wales across many denominations. And our invitation is for all to get together with others in their area, as you are doing today, other denominations as well, to swap lessons, share stories, share tools, experiment, and dare I say, even pray together to discern where we go together locally on these issues, how we interact with others in the community. I'm pleased to hear mention of Transition Town earlier. It's vital we work with others in the community. So us meeting today like this is one manifestation of community, and we're seeing more and more Eco Church conferences springing up around the country. And one of the things that delights me is when we get an email or a phone call saying, we are having an Eco Church conference. Would a Rocha like to come? I think that's fantastic. That's just what we want. We can't possibly organize this all with 2.5 people. It makes my day really when people like you say, we're doing this and would we like to pitch up? That's fantastic. But another manifestation of this is we're developing a volunteer advisory network where people with particular knowledge and experience within the network, and there will be many of you on this call now who know something very particular that others could use. We're setting up this volunteer system now where you can contact somebody else who knows about this to say, give me 20 minutes of input. So whether it's on how to manage your churchyard for nature, or whether it's, dare I say it, how do you get your church leadership on board with this because they're a bit stuck. There are people out there expert in these things in this network. And apologies to all of you who are in church leadership and totally get it, but you will know that not all of your peers do. So sometimes we need a little bit of help to figure out how to maneuver through the church system. So that's one way it's becoming a community. Finally, how can we as churches and Eco Church hold the government to account? How does Eco Church help with that? Well, there is a small built-in function on the platform that guides people towards campaigning ideas and the latest campaign. It's not much used at the moment. We may need to make it much more visible, but it's always been the intention that Eco Church allows people to campaign, to get together with other Eco Churches and put their names to thing or dream up campaigns if they want to. But excitingly, this year, we have a particular opportunity and responsibility, and that is to influence the national and international action when we, the UK, as I'm sure many of you are aware, are actually hosting international climate negotiations in Glasgow, in fact, in November. Now, these are not any old negotiations to come back to where I began with the Paris Agreement. This is an absolutely critical conference, delayed from last year because of COVID, when it would have been 5 years after Paris. It's now 6 years after Paris. It was always planned that at this conference, the world would review its progress towards the Paris targets. And I've just told you, we are way off course. It would agree more relevant targets if necessary. It absolutely needs to do so. And it would agree financing for developing countries in particular who need help to shift off fossil fuel and help to adapt to the climate change that's already happening. So to enable churches across the country to have a big influence on this, we have collaborated with others, with the denominations, Church of England, Methodists, Baptist, Catholic Church, and with many other organizations like Tear Fund and Christian Aid and so on, to set up something called the Climate Sunday Initiative. And we are asking all eco churches to participate in that this year as a way of raising their voice together. The idea is very simple. We're inviting people to hold a climate focused service anytime between now and preferably a couple of months before the COP conference in November. But if it's the day before the conference, that doesn't matter. And at that service to do two things. One, at that service or soon after, to commit to taking the church further in its own action on cutting carbon. And that could look like, if you've registered as a church for Eco Church, but not actually got an award, why don't you commit to getting to bronze in the next 6 months? If you've got a bronze and you're a bit stuck, why not commit to getting to silver within the next year? So that's our commitment as churches. But Climate Sunday is also inviting churches to speak up together to demand that the government keeps to their promises. And there's a common declaration called the Time Is Now Declaration. It's already up on the website, where individuals and churches, oh, brilliant, Catherine has put the link up in the chat box. Thank you very much, colleague, that's wonderful. If you go on that, you will see it's very, very easy. And there are loads of resources free for different styles of church, different denominations to hold a service, but also increasingly thematic resources that link climate and nature, climate and food, climate and justice, and so on. So depending on the particular interests of people in your church, you can find a way in on the subject that really interests them, which may be helpful. So we've already got over 1,000 churches that have registered to do a service, but it would be wonderful if we could get to 10,000. That's what we're aiming for. We'd love to see 25% of the churches in the UK holding a Climate Sunday service. And at that point, I think the government would be taking very, very serious look at what the churches are saying and would be influenced greatly, not just in the UK for the future in UK government policy, but actually at the talks internationally. So to conclude, climate disruption is an existential threat to humans and the rest of nature. We can't avoid that anymore. We have to be honest about that. But addressing it is also a profound opportunity for human society to learn to live in balance with other parts of God's creation, as he intended. Christians and churches, I believe, have unique assets to deal with this. And I haven't mentioned other things like our political influence, whether we like it or not. The Church of England has several bishops in the House of Lords. Our international communication networks of the denominations. We have so many assets I haven't even touched upon. And Rocha UK, with many others, because Eco Church is very much a collective, a collaboration, even if it's formally led by Rocha. Rocha offers Eco Church as a community, as a framework, as a toolkit to help your church contribute to this great challenge of not just getting its own carbon emissions down, but helping the UK do that. And I look forward to working with you as local churches, as area expressions, whether it's dioceses or circuits or whatever, to work on this over the next decade, because I think it's going to take that long. But I absolutely welcome the ambition of the Church of England, Church of Scotland, Church in Wales, and I think many others now saying we've got to do this by 2030. We cannot wait till 2050, as governments are at the moment proposing. We very much hope that we, the churches, can play a part in changing government ambition to bring it forward, but also to bring about the real policies that will be needed to get there. Let me hand over now to questions.
Thank you, Andy. That's so positive to hear. There's so much that resonates with, I think, the experience of everyone sort of within their parishes and within their diocese. That's really inspiring. So thank you. And we've got a couple of questions in. So the first one from Phil, where would be a good place to start for a congregation with a small available budget?
I think I would start with those things you can do. Yes, some of the actions that in the end would be good to take will cost money. I always advise people to start where they can. That obviously is economically feasible, but it also builds confidence that more can happen. So don't start by picking the most expensive thing if you know you haven't got the money. is the simple advice. But I also think, one of the things we together can do better is to look for sources of finance for those churches that and there are many that cannot afford to do the sort of things they would love to do. I have been in discussion over the years with a couple of bishops, for example, of what if the church commissioners could fund some investment fund that would make it much easier for churches to draw down finance for this. I don't know where that's got to be honest. I need to return to that theme, and Catherine, if there's anybody around here will know more about that, it'll be Catherine, I think. But I think we must do more to make it possible for poorer churches to act, but always start with what you can do. I would say don't worry too much about what you can't.
Yep, fantastic, thank you. So another question for you, Andy. How do we work collectively to make climate-friendly living affordable for all? So that's from Edwin, who says that they are based in a city with high indices of multiple deprivation.
Yeah, no, it's really, really good question. I mean, this is where I come back to actually influencing government policy, because we have to recognize that although we individually can do so much, actually it's the government that has the levers of power to make it easy for everybody to do it. Now, if I could just take one analogy, some of you know I used to run Friends of the Earth, and it was Friends of the Earth 20 years ago now that ran the campaign that led to curbside recycling, the blue top bins in my area. Before that, you had to be a weird greenie to actually be recycling. There was sort of one in every street. They thought a bit weird. A lot of other people might have thought, well, I'm up for that, but how do I do it? It wasn't until the government brought in the law that led to councils having to put out curbside recycling that everybody did it, or many more people did it, okay? So we have to be really clear here that there are certain situations where the individual can't actually themselves do all that much. We need the government to pull the levers of power. That's why I always say, connect your practical action, whatever it is, tell the government about it and say, now you do your bit, okay? However, I do think that the same answer applies as I gave to Phil earlier. I think we have to recognize that, particularly in poorer inner city areas, and actually in some rural ones too, the church finance and the individual's families' finance is not strong. So you can only start with what you can afford. However, I do think that working together on this, I remember way back in the 70s, actually, my dad's a vicar. My parents were vicars in the East End of London, actually a very poor area. We actually set up a bulk food buying cooperative, my parents did, whereby we could actually buy together more food than we could if we just did it individually, because we could buy it in larger quantities. So there are things like that that can be explored that also build community, because they have people working together. So those are some very brief ideas, but I realize it's a challenge. Ultimately, it's not our fault individually if we can't afford to do something. We need to we need to not beat ourselves up, but say, who could change this? And very often it's the government. So we do need to speak to local and national government. Yes, good point from Mark, I've just seen.
Yes, please. So the question is, so Mark has said, local government elections are this week. What do you think local councils need to focus on to prevent a climate disaster?
Yeah, I mean, there are a range of things, but very briefly, they need to focus on what levers they've got to affect carbon emissions locally. So that would be transport very often. It would be the investments they're planning to make in roads or in new housing developments or whatever. Now, let me say now, people need houses, but the way those houses are built, whether they are simply just storing up more problems for the future because they're really not very environmentally sound, or whether they are made much more future-proof, is a really big issue. And at the moment, there's no reason at all why councils can't insist on that. They don't, because the developers put such pressure on them to go for expensive but not very good housing. Okay, so getting the councils to focus on what levers they've got, like transport, like housing policy, and so on. Now, in rural areas, also farming is important. I realize that local authorities have less control over that, but national legislation that actually affects the degree of the way things are farmed is also really important in rural areas for air pollution, for one thing, but also in the end for storing carbon. So local councils can also be making their views known to the national government about national policy. And very often they go, oh, it's nothing to do with us, it's national. Yeah, but they're the ones who can talk to them.
And a nice simple one for you to answer in 2 minutes, Andy, from Robert. To what extent do you fear that humankind has already left it too late and got past the tipping point?
So I think scientists will tell you that there are a number of, it's a good question. So we don't know is the short story. Nobody knows. What we do know is, well, this is where I'm at least, is that if we do not move very fast, there is a high likelihood that that will happen. And I think that's basically, this is not just me saying this. I mean, I think you've got the world's top climate scientists brought out a report 2 years ago now. And they were basically saying in that, and this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is 1,000 scientists, you know, and often quite conservative people, to be honest, because the governments actually don't want them to say some of this. So these reports get watered down. But even they were saying 2 years ago, we've got about 10 years to get emissions down very, very sharply, to have even a 50% chance. That's not a high probability, just a 50% chance of sticking on the right side of 1.5 degrees. So just be really clear, you know, it's very possible we've left it too late. However, I would say if your child is running towards a cliff, you don't go, it's too late, I'll let them go over. You shout, you scream, you run, you do everything you can to avoid that. So I don't think it makes any difference to what we need to do, to be honest.
Absolutely. Perfect. Thank you so much, Andy.